Hello everybody. I thought I would take the fall for the liberal majority brothers and sisters and listen to the Mike Cernovich interview with Nabil Aziz and do you guys a favor to save you from having to be tortured by it. Some of you may not find Cernovich's, a lot of those with liberal temperaments tend to be a lot of my female classmates in this scope. We find it difficult to listen to Cernovich, and that's not because there's anything wrong with him at all, but when you have a liberal temperament, the way that you hear things becomes a slightly more difficult. But the other thing is that some conservatives called up to argue with this guy live, and they could have delivered infinitely better arguments. And for that reason, I thought I would try and share with you some of those counter arguments that you can use or think over.
Exactly what the founding fathers said. I mean, as belief.
So, I'm going to start off with this guy who asked a question. I'm putting it fast forward. So it normally goes like this. The people call up and say, how can you ascribe to something where your leader murdered and killed and did certain things? The response back is, well, look what Obama did. Well, you know, the Constitution didn't recognize Negroes. You know, this is how they use the word at the time, right? So they'll say a lot of things like that. If anyone can see where I'm going with this, they're saying, you know, normally it's, well, you know, how can you tell me that my guy's bad if your guy is just as bad, right? So that falls on two specific pillars, let's just say. One is comparing people's behavior as opposed to comparing their intent is discounting one of the factors. So there are two monsters, right? And how do we know in a movie? One is they're comparing two monsters and they're ignoring the component of intent. So when you go to a movie, right? For example, right? If you went and saw that Superman, the new Superman that came out a few years ago, like 2 years ago, and you saw that Superman and Zod were fighting, and then you look at the Batman movie, Batman vs. Superman, and you see that Batman hates Superman because Superman's activities actually killed people. So I'm not sure if anyone saw that, but that's more of a guy thing, right? But the reason that the movies make Batman look like he hates Superman is because Batman feels that Superman's powers are responsible for the murder of his friends, which he is. On prima facie, it does look like that. But what he ignores, you know, for example, some people end up hating the heroes because the heroes fighting against the bad guys are actually killing innocent people because, you know, these fights are massive, right? And buildings fall down and people die. So it's very easy to then say, oh, well, you know, look, the bad guys were fighting the bad superheroes were fighting the good superheroes or whatever you want to call them, right? And people died. So then does that mean that we blame both equally? Well, no one does that. Why is it that we still root for the superhero even though he's also killing these innocent people in this fight? Because we know that the superhero has intent, good intent. In other words, it allows you to predict the behavior of the superhero in the future. It means you can live with a monster like that because the superhero is not going to go and kill innocent people. But the evil guy is. And the superhero in his fight against the evil guy, but some of the innocent people who die in those fights are dying because the good guy is fighting the bad guy and the ensuing destruction causes a catastrophe. Right? And so therefore there are people who are subjected to being victims of this innocent person. So it's very easy to call him evil. So that is if I can deliver that concept to you, if it makes any sense, that is the argument that you want to develop against someone who says a very common argument in the Islamic world where people say, well, look what George Bush did to Iraq. Look what you did to the African Americans, which they call Negroes, right? Because they don't have political correctness. And your response is, well, you're comparing actions, you're not comparing intent. So when the conservatives say, how do you ascribe to a prophet who endorsed these type of killings? Their response is, well, look at you and Obama and that. Well, you're saying, well, no. Because you as the conservative or the liberal or whatever, you denounce what Obama and those type of people are doing and you are disgusted and you're horrified and you regret it. That's a difference, right? It is a small difference, but over the fourth dimension, it's a very big difference because it predicts future behavior. Whereas this gentleman who ascribes to his prophet actually is thereby endorsing the prophet's behavior because he considers him a perfect man. So he does not apologize for his behavior, which means that if given the same circumstances, right, he would be fine with repeating that behavior. And that is the difference. Does that make any sense to what I'm actually saying? I'm not actually sure, because that's a very key argument that I notice conservatives don't bring up. And conservatives are the warriors at the moment, right? In this point in history, as I said, truth modulates in 4 dimensions. It oscillates between left and right temperaments. Like people who have different temperaments can see things differently. And so they see different truths, right? Depending on what the truth is at that point in time. And I know my brother's going to argue with me, right? This argument only works with honest people. Possibly. I don't know. My brother's extremely honest, but it doesn't work with him. They don't ascribe to large delivering of people from deception causes considerable collateral damage. Europe from Hitler, I will discuss with them all the time. I discuss with them all the time. Yes, yeah, that's true. Like, and then of course the blowback of fighting against Hitler produced Stalin, and then of course that was a later evil, and then that Stalin actually produced Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. So that doesn't mean it's a good or a bad thing, but yes, it causes a lot of blowback. The difference is that you are reflecting on that and thinking, how can we fix that? How can we make the world a better place? Well, so is this guy. So another woman actually called up and said, you know, you guys don't integrate, everyone else does. And then the moderate Muslim came back, scales matter. The moderate Muslim came back and said to her, and she couldn't argue back. And this is, I'm going to give you another argument. So this is argument number 2 that I'm giving you, right? She came, if I miss anything, DM me on Twitter, because I might have missed something. Correct, we are all afflicted by the human condition. This is true. So she came to him and said, you know, you guys don't integrate, right? So she called out what on the surface is obvious. But then he responded and called out something that's just beneath the surface that's also obvious, right? And this is what they do. They've learned counter arguments, but they haven't learned counter arguments. That's what I should have called this thing, counter arguments. And he said to her, well, you have in New York, he said to her, you have in New York Hasidic Jews, you have, you know, in other places, you have Little China, Little Cuba, you have all these places, and they're not integrating either. So how can you ask us to integrate? Either you have multiculturalism or you have monoculturalism. You have to make up your mind. And she didn't know how to respond. And that's when I thought, I have to come on the scope and tell you guys, okay? So this is how you respond. You say that it requires, all these different cultures cohabitating requires a certain distance from a common culture that has an acceptance of a certain way of life. So the Constitution, even though, yes, the Hasidic Jews wouldn't accept you in their place if you walked in wearing shorts, or, you know, you go to Cuba and you go to mini Cuba, and if you say something about the Castro regime, they might come after you because they're probably all against the Castro regime for being in the US. You know, all these type of things. But the differences that each of these cultures have, the distance away from the combined culture through which America is surviving, or Western civilization is surviving, so what we all have in common, is not enough to shift the balance to the point where Western civilization collapses. So for example, you have the moon and it orbits around the earth. Now the moon tugs the earth as it does that, right? But we live with that. So, you know, Cubans come in, Chinese come in, and yes, they do modulate culture, right? I've come in, my parents have come in, and all of us together, you know, you are missing the ideological perspective that forbids Muslims to integrate. No, I'm not arguing that. So that's a good point. And that's what, you know, that was one of the things, and thank you for bringing that up, because that's one of the things that the lady brought up with the guy. But that's not the argument. See, because the argument by the Muslim, he was agreeing with you. So we're all agreeing, right? The lady who called up agrees with what you said. And the moderate Muslim guy, Nabil Aziz, who responded to her, agrees with what you said. So his argument was not to integrate. He said, how can you ask me to integrate when none of these other groups integrate? That was his response. So that would defeat the response you brought up. He's playing games. Okay, but saying playing games is a sign of losing the argument, right? Not you personally. I'm saying when people say that to people, define integrate. Okay, which is what I was just doing. And what my response was, people actually don't integrate, right? Now be careful, this is a weird concept, right? But you got to slow down and hear what I'm saying. Like, you have good arguments, but your arguments are not what I'm discussing right now, because what you're saying is all completely makes sense. Everything you're saying makes sense. But the moderate Muslim is agreeing with what you're saying. That's the difference, right? So the moderate Muslim is saying, I don't integrate. You're right. I don't integrate. I don't want to integrate with you, right? But he's saying, how can you as a conservative ask me to integrate when no one else integrates? Now, that's actually a good point, right? Now, we got to be really careful here, because what he did was he agreed with you, and these are not my arguments. I should have explained. I just finished listening to the 2 hour and 50-minute interview between Nabil Aziz and Mike Cernovich, and that's very difficult for people on the liberal side, right? Like, I think, because Mike Cernovich has a right-wing temperament. Yeah, exactly, playing the devil's advocate, yeah. And it's very difficult for people like us to maybe listen to Mike Cernovich, because he has a right-wing temperament, which means he's naturally more abrasive. And so it's very difficult to listen to him. But I deliberately force myself if it's something that's really important to listen to. And Nabil Aziz was there, and he declares himself a moderate Muslim. Moderate Muslims defined, please. Okay, Nabil Aziz, he calls himself a moderate Muslim. Now, he defined it at the beginning of the conversation as a Muslim who follows the law of the Quran Kareem strictly. Oh, you heard parts? Okay. He was dishonest. And you could be right? This is not an argument against you being right or not. This is where we are drawing conclusions from facts. Now, is it true that he said stuff? We're getting into what we wanted. The whole point of this cast is to talk about counter arguments, right? So what Mike Cernovich has done today, he has given this moderate Muslim a voice, and the moderate Muslim won the debates. Now, what Mike Cernovich is an unbelievably intelligent guy, right? And for me to, once again, that's just an opinion, right? But it's an opinion coming from someone who's a liberal and does not enjoy listening to him. So you can take that as you wish. The way I see what he's doing is he's exposing the arguments onto conservatives, and conservatives were unable to fight back now. But what conservatives are going to do, because conservatives are the fighters, right, at this point in history, they are going to learn from how they could not argue back and develop better arguments. So what Mike Cernovich has done, he's actually done the West a favor, because he's exposing the arguments to allow people to generate counter arguments that are even better. And so my goal is to assist you guys in the sense that there's not much that I know about, a lot of, but in this section, because I've been studying it for so long, it's something that I can perhaps throw in some arguments for you, and then you can take them and argue back. So we come to, you were saying before, the liberal guy, Muslims don't integrate, right? And I'm not here to argue against or for you. I'm just picking up your point. The thing is that the moderate Muslim guy agrees with you. So the moderate Muslim guy is actually quite intelligent. What he's learned, Nabil Aziz, he's learned to take your arguments and agree with them, and then develop a counter argument. So what you have to do now, and hopefully with small assistance from my limited knowledge, is to actually take his arguments, agree with them, and then have another counter argument back. And it's going to keep going, right? So here's the response. He agreed with the lady. The lady called up and said, you Muslims don't integrate. He agreed with her. So by agreeing with her, he took her argument away from her. All right, so he won. But then he came with a counter. So first of all, he dodged her punch, and then he punched her. So the point that I want to show here is, he dodged my punch. He comes back, I dodge his, and then I hit him. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do here. So he agreed with her. By agreeing with her, he agreed with her and said, yes, we Muslims don't integrate. Bang, your argument's gone. All right, she's on the floor. Then he came back and said, but, okay, now she's going to lose her argument. He said to her, but neither does any other culture in the US. He said, if you go to the Hasidic Jew section, right, you cannot function in that section. They're going to harass you and accost you if you sort of are doing homosexual things or stuff like that. That's actually true, but that can easily be defeated. And that's what I wanted to bring up in this cast. He said to her, right, he agreed with her, and then he came back and said, but neither does anyone else. Hasidic Jews, the Cubans, there are certain things you cannot do. The point is, how do you then defeat that argument? Well, what you then say is you agree with him. You do agree that people don't integrate. But what you do is you say that the cultures that are not integrating vary by a smaller degree. And that smaller degree actually allows Western civilization to function. So as I came back to about 10 minutes ago, I was talking about the moon orbiting the Earth. The moon orbiting the Earth causes the Earth to shift slightly. So in other words, when other cultures come in, they do modulate the actual aggregate culture slightly. But if you had another Earth orbiting Earth, right, Earth wouldn't shift slightly, Earth would violently swing. And that's the point. The argument is that this guy's version of Islam, being the strict text of the Quran, is so different. Our views overlap. So what they are called overlapping magisteria, right? So you can say that they are all cultures that do not integrate are overlapping magisteria to varying degrees. And those discrepancies allow us to function as a society because the parts that are non-overlapping magisteria, like Olympic rings, awesome. So there are parts of the rings that don't overlap, but the parts are not too much. Whereas if there was one ring that sat on the outside, it would look weird and it would stuff up the logo. So it's the same thing. When you have a culture that is almost mutually exclusive in its overlapping magisteria, in other words, it's non-overlapping magisteria, right? And not only that, but they actually are in sharp contradiction, then you're going to have a problem. And that's why if you want to define it like that, yes, we're not asking people to integrate. We're asking people to modulate. That would be the argument in response. Whoever befriends the disbelievers goes to hell. 328. Yes, you did mention that. The problem is with what you're saying is that most people already know that. You have another question? Why do Muslims leave their home to go be welfare slaves to foreign countries if Islam is so great? Well, I don't know who's saying Islam is so great. I'm not here defending Islam. I'm here to help you develop counter arguments against articulate moderate Muslims. Islam is about love and peace. Thug life. Well, then that means you're not a Muslim if you like thug life. And Islam is about peace. But once again, there's been a few people here coming out and arguing about whether Islam and Muslims, they're conflating two different things, right? Because you got to argue, one you have to figure out whether you're arguing against the text or the people, right? So if you want to focus your argument, right, and use logic, number one, you're already going to be talking to you pessimists, don't judge me by my name. Well, you're the one asking me if I was Muslim, so I believe you're just doing the judging. But I do appreciate your input, as always. My experience is that Muslims love to deflect. Well, we're coming back to conflating Islam and Muslims again. We have to be very careful about our arguments, right? I think the West may need to just close its borders or else war will be inevitable. Yes, war is inevitable by opening your borders. Yes, that is true. This is an extreme attitude. I'm not sure if possible. That's crazy. Yeah, it is crazy. It is an extreme attitude and it's not possible. It is not possible to curtail immigration, I'm sure, if that's impossible. No, it's not possible because Christian ideology facilitates open borders. And what I mean by that, I don't mean original conservative Christians. I mean the fake Christianity that has formed post-World War I, when people live in the shadow of a dying sunlight of Christianity of old, but they don't actually know that it's Christianity. They think it's being nice, and they think this is a human condition. But look, if you love it, that's great. That's what I love about free speech. The Creator made it. If you're being sincere, you will love it. Okay, well, that's an ideological viewpoint. And if you swap Islam with Christianity and said the same thing, then there's no different argument if you want to use that argument. Sharia law and blasphemy is against free speech. Yes, it is against free speech. But the argument that we'll use is that there is no free speech because if you try and say something that the leftists don't like, that the fake left doesn't like, then you get shut down. So once again, you'll lose that argument. The concept is something that arose out of Western civilization, which began around my ancestry. I knew I was hearing an Australian accent. Yeah, it's funny. You're one of the first people who say that on occasion. Yes, as Carl Jung described, the line between, what is it? The line to hell, or the path to hell, splits down our own hearts, or something like that. That's a very, very bad recitation. But basically, good and evil lives within us. Yes, but once again, that is a idea that is not fake leftist and not Islamic. So the Quran shows that the believers are the ones who are pure and those who disbelieve are impure. So there are degrees of purity. And they're called in the Quran al-mu'mineen, ayyuha al-mu'mineen, which means the believers, which originally actually included Christians and Jews at the time. And that's why there was a lot of using of churches for prayer for al-mu'mineen before they became al-muslimin. But over time, of course, they diverge. But that took a couple of hundred years if you use history. Yeah, the people of the book, yeah. If you, probably a good idea is to look up Tom Holland. Your argument is that what a lot of Arabic Quranic scholars will do is they'll say you don't understand that, you're taking it out of context. Or the other argument they say is that was what was required at the time because he had to defend himself amongst threat. He is biased. The interesting thing about humans is that everyone is biased. We just don't see our own biases. Well, at least you can read the Quran and read, unlike these guys who just get references from hate page. Well, the first chapter of the Quran talks about al-Dhalin. So, and that's actually the prayer. It's in Surah Al-Fatiha, which is the opening chapter of the Quran. And it actually says, and it's part of their prayer when they pray 5 times per day, which is, what is it? Pray for the misguided, al-Dhalin. Kill them if they don't acknowledge the religion of truth. I know you keep using the same verses, and the problem is you're frustrated that other people aren't seeing those verses and immediately falling to your position. I said this in, I think, a scope about 4 scopes ago. We get frustrated with people's apparent inability to see the truth that is so self-evident to us. Well, do you know why the Muslims were able to conquer Spain in the 700s? Who knows the real reason why they won? I want to see if anyone knows. And I'll give you a hint. There were 3 Christian factions in Spain, right? Why do you think that throughout history, gods have always been described as all-seeing, right? All-seeing, it's always eyes. Look at Jordan Peterson's descriptions of the history of gods. They always are the eye. It's all about seeing, right? Osiris, Horus, Marduk. It's all about the eyes. In Spain, one of the Christian leaders turned against the other 2 and sided with the Muslims. Jesus is a prophet, mortal man. Well, a lot of Christians believed that. In fact, the Christians who went into the Middle East through the banning of Unitarian Christianity in Europe believed that. And in fact, their name for Jesus was the praised one. And the praised one in Arabic is Muhammad. We only die once and don't die after that. How do you know this? Have you been there and come back to tell us? It's one of his names, not his real name. I have faith. Okay, but you see, that's what Christians say, that's what Jews say, that's what other people say, I have faith. Fake leftists have faith in postmodernism. Consciousness continues after death. Are you dead and telling us this? Is that how you know? So I think the first 10 minutes of this cast is all you need to listen to. But if you're hearing me say this, then you've already listened to the whole cast. So I'm sorry. I have a spirit and soul. But you see, saying there's other dimensions, I agree with you that there are other dimensions. In fact, most physicists agree with you that there are other dimensions. But how you know that those dimensions are exactly the way you believe? You don't have to answer comments. This is not in line with your topic. Yeah, it's my ADHD. I get distracted like crazy. I left my body before and can vouch there is a soul. I don't disagree with you. You can't leap from there is a soul to you know exactly what that soul is. is there something deeper? Well, there are some militant atheists, and they're not atheists, they're anti-theists, who say there is no God. You can't say that. You cannot say there is no God. And in fact, if you study abstract mathematics like I've done, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that the abstract is more real than the real. In fact, the real comes from the abstract. And so the abstract is timeless, right? And absolute morality is embedded within that. You can argue that. But to then say that that is Christianity, or that is define abstract in this context, the best thing to do is go to Jordan Peterson. He's a Christian, but his arguments in this part are quite coherent, where he talks about things that different cultures across different time spans find through evolutionary psychology to actually be true independent of humans. So things, for example, like don't lie, don't steal. Okay, this is a very botched up argument because I really want to go now and go finish my work. Nationalism rising up will not stop it. No. Yeah, to answer Liran just quickly, here is my. Obviously no one knows, right? But I can tell you that I can say with at least 95% certainty that the West will be destroyed. And it's already destroyed. It's already a dead carcass that we're living in. And it's just getting hacked away by the vultures. And the reason I think that is for a lot of reasons, but the main ones are, you look at every Semitic group in the Middle East, being my ancestors and every other ancestor, right? Why is it that every single one of them was wiped out as a culture and are now sort of, there's only a few people left dying, right? So they occupied, right, all these other countries that they were not Muslim countries. Turkey, Iraq, Syria, all these places were Semitic Christian countries. And they were identically genetically related to the Hebrews and the Coptics in Egypt, yes. But the Coptics were not purely Semitic. They come from the Pharaohs, which are a different genetic strain. They're Cushites and Berbers, but I won't get into that. Why is it? Tell me why is it that every single one of those Christian communities were wiped out? Why is it that only the Jews survived, right? Why? Now, the thing is, we talk about living in Western civilization and we call it Judeo-Christian. There is a difference between the Jewish and the Christian philosophies. The Christians, and I've never met a Christian who agrees with me. So I'm not asking you to agree with me. This is just my view now, right? Propaganda time, warning, right? The Christians have in their book what I think cursed them for eternity, which is, right? And like I said, I've never met a Christian who agrees with me, and I'm not saying I'm right. It's just a hypothesis, and if you can prove me wrong, awesome, right? Jesus told them, if your brother strikes you on your left cheek, turn and invite him to strike you on his right, right? Something like that, okay? And then they asked, how many times should I forgive my brother? 70, 7 or 70? And then Jesus said, Sab'a asaba'in, right? You have Jewish ancestry. That's why your love for Israel. Sab'a ala saba'in in biblical Arabic, right? Which means it's not 70 times, it's not 77 as they say in the English text. It's 70. It either means one of two things. Either means 70 times 7, right? Which is what's that, 490, or it is an infinite amount of 7s and 70s, which is what, if you look at the whole of the Christian context, that makes more sense. In other words, forgive your brother an unlimited amount of times. These things that Jesus invented, forgive my use of the word invention, right? But these concepts that came into Christianity, I think, have led to the destruction of Christianity. It allowed people to critique Christianity to the point where Nietzsche, in the 1800s, was it 1800? No, the 1900s, sorry, absolutely destroyed Christianity to pieces and removed the fundamental value system of Western civilization. And from that point until now, we have been living in the afterglow of a value system that was Christianity. We try to pretend it's Western. We try to pretend it's not. It's not a value system that is inherent in all cultures of the world. And I can tell you this because I have lived in the Middle East for a long time, and they do not share these values. The Christian ones do. The liberal people, most of them fled, and that's all you've got left now, right? And then, of course, this part was the destruction of Christianity itself. And so this explains to me why every single Semitic community, the Armenians, the Syriacs, the Maronite Lebanese, which were all Lebanese at one point. Well, no, that's not true. There were some Jews and stuff. The Jews in Lebanon, the Jews in Iraq and Syria, they all were wiped out, right? And only Israel survived. Now, if anyone studied the Old Testament, which I've noticed most Christians haven't, and it killed me. Deuteronomy killed me. I don't think I even got through all of Deuteronomy. And then I read the books of the Maccabees, which were the Apocrypha in between Testaments. The Jews have within their culture an idea that of Israel and the God's chosen people and an eye for an eye. They don't have the luxury of Jesus saying, forgive everyone. The Jews have in their text the ability to fight back. And that is the only reason, in my humble view, that they have been able to survive while every single other Semitic community was wiped out. Well, there is a hadith where Muhammad said, kill the man who was doing it and the one to whom it is being done, that he was talking about homosexuality. Whether or not you want to accept that hadith is up to you. Not all Muslims do. So you can't talk about Islam or Muslims. If you want to talk about Islam, you have to talk about the Quran. I think it's a sign of weakness when people don't know what they're talking about. That's not you. Sorry, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking in general when people have opinions. For me, it's important. If I'm going to have an opinion, I have to know what the hell I'm talking about. And even till now, I don't know, like compared to an imam, right? Like they memorize every single word. People don't go to church and the Vatican is corrupt. Yes, and so are many imams. In fact, if you look at Sheikh Tawhidi or Imam Tawhidi in Australia, he actually says that most imams cannot be open about wanting to befriend Jews because they get supported by Saudiyin. Is being a lesbian allowed in Islam? Once again, you're talking about Islam and about Muslims. Two different things. And most Middle Eastern Christians don't even know what the Old Testament is. They call it the Jew book, the book of the Jews. What is the difference in Islam and Muslim? The difference is that Islam is a text and Muslim are adherents to the text. So in the same way that you have in America, you have America and Americans. You have the Constitution and you have people who adhere to the Constitution. But as you can see, people adhere to it in varying degrees. And that's why you have arguments. You look at Scalia, who was a strict constitutionalist. It depends on how much you adhere to the doctrine as to how Muslim you are, in a way. But of course, you have a second overlay. You also have the cultural Muslim. So I have a lot of Muslim brothers and sisters who say they're Muslim, but they drink, they have bacon, that you call them the bacon eating Muslims, right? So, and they smoke, and, like this guy that's friends with my parents, he is a Muslim who converted to Christianity, but he's neither. Islam is submission to the Lord. Muslim is someone who believes in one God and the message. Well, by your definition, most Muslims are not Muslims, because if you put a gun to most Muslims' heads and said, tell me right now that you believe or I'm going to shoot you, I guarantee you that not everyone will say they believe at gunpoint. And it's the same with most adherents to most religions, right? So they are allowed to compromise then. Yes, because of taqiyya. So there you go, another abrogation. What's a moderate Muslim? I would recommend, if you want to know what a moderate Muslim is, go to Mike Cernovich and look up his latest video where he interviews for 2 hours and 49 minutes a moderate Muslim who defines himself. Moderate Muslims, right? There are two definitions. There are the ones who are defined by us in the West, who call them moderate Muslims. And then there are those Muslims who call themselves moderate Muslims. Now, those who call themselves moderate Muslims, who follow people like Nabil Aziz calls himself a moderate Muslim, but he defines it by one who adheres strictly to the Quran. Now, using that definition, then you would call him a radical, because the Quran, letter by letter, is infinitely more what you'd call radical than Christianity ever was. I'm talking about Nabil Aziz. Nabil Aziz he believes that Muslims should leave America and go back to Muslim countries. Now, so do conservatives. Don't be silly, you don't have to apologize. It makes me angry. That part makes me angry, and that's where my bias is, right? Because he calls my country, right? I know I'm Australian, but I also have Lebanese citizenship. He calls that a Muslim country, and that makes me unbelievably furious, right? I mean, that's why there was a civil war. There are people that want to call it their country. So the last thing I'm going to say, this is it. The last thing I'm going to say, and I'm going to go. Western civilization is doomed. The last thing I'm going to say, don't look at the comments, please continue. Sorry, yes. Let me, all right. So I'm going to block the comments. So Western civilization is doomed. It's not that it is doomed in the future. I'm not prophesizing that it's doomed. I'm telling you it's already doomed. When we were born, if you were born after the 50s, you were born into a dead civilization, right? And that is why those who possess the baton or the cup of Western civilization are a dying breed. We're not reproducing because we don't want to. Right? We don't care enough about Western civilization to put in effort, because it requires a lot of effort to teach children about our history. And the history of Western civilization, it goes back to my ancestors, right? Who invented ships and invented the alphabet, the beginning of free speech, right? Now where are we, right? We're wiped out to nothing. Now we're just around the world, right? And it's the same with every single Western civilization. The Phoenicians, which were my ancestors who invented the alphabet, the Greeks, who invented trigonometry, and then we keep going all the way out through Europe and coming into America. They all are a dying breed, right? They require new lands to then thrive, and they require an ideology which they lost. They lost Christianity, and they have not yet developed a new one. And that's why Jordan Peterson is so popular, because he is showing atheists that you can have a value system deeper than Christianity itself. And without that, you will all die. And so I'll tell you, Lebanon, to me, the death of Lebanon is already the death of all of us, because Lebanon was a Western Christian European country. It was one of the most advanced countries in the world. Every celebrity went there, right? Now, they had dark and disgusting flaws as much as every other Western democracy does, right? But right now, it's a failed state, right? And that is a perfect example of what already is coming. And I've been saying this for 30 years, and it's gone now to Western Europe. Why? Because Western Europe and Lebanon were identical in their value systems. So Lebanon was open borders, very leftist, very liberal. We had a small Islamic minority, okay? And it's an exact replay of events on a larger scale. So there is nothing that I see in every single day's news that is different in the UK than what happened in Lebanon 50 years ago, right? So it's just replaying itself on a larger scale. It's like dominoes, right? The small one collapsed, all the rest are going to collapse. There's nothing you can do to stop it. So I'll tell you in history what has happened when people have tried to stop it. It's a hard life when you aren't white. That comment that the other person said, you have no idea how important it is that you understand what that person just said. Their resentment for the West is going to cause them to side with the radicals against you in the upcoming civil war. And that's what happened in Lebanon, because the Catholics ran Lebanon. The Orthodox said, I want this country to come down because it's so much harder when you're not Catholic. Anyone remember Slobodan Milosevic from Serbia, who died of a heart attack in jail after being indicted for war crimes? Slobodan Milosevic, do you have a blog? Yeah, go to Facebook, Gabsmacked, Gabsmacked. And also I have SoundCloud/real Gabsmacked, and YouTube is just Gabsmacked as well. And I have different Q&As, and this one will probably go on there as well, I think. Milosevic, right, the only thing he could do was start to ethnically cleanse his part of the Balkans. And who stopped him? Who stopped him was the Americans. The Americans came in and fought on the side of the Muslims against Slobodan Milosevic. Now, in history, Slobodan is going to be remembered as a war criminal, except if you're Serbian. But in about 100 years' time, when America is about 70% Muslim and conservatives are a small minority, just like now in Lebanon, you will look back, they slaughtered Bosnians. This is true. They did slaughter Bosnians. And that is horrific and disgusting and evil. But the point is that Slobodan saw that his civilization was being eroded and attacked over decades and decades and decades. Now, we would never do that. So that's the point. That is why I say to you, Western civilization is dead. Because either you do nothing and just talk about things like we are, and it's collapsing as we speak, or you become like Slobodan and start to ethnically cleanse the situation. Now, these things, what happened in Lebanon was both. So in Lebanon, they opened their borders, then there were more terrorist attacks. And it kept growing from the 1930s up to 1958. Then there was a massive uprising. Then the uprising was put down by the government. Then more terrorist attack came, and attacks 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 for 30 years, right? So keep in mind, September 11th was only 16 years ago. So we're already halfway through the terrorist attacks that Lebanon had been going through, right? Now, what happened? I've told some of you know this. What happened in 1982? The most insane, psychopathic, so-called Christian rises up and leads a movement. And that movement, 2 days after he was assassinated, murdered 6,000 Muslims in one night. Now, what was the result of that? That turned the civil war in Lebanon to having another 9 years left. Because what happened was that the psychopathic Christians were so crazy that the secular moderate Christians didn't want to have anything to do with them. So then the psychopathic Christians, the American X-style Nazis, they considered them traitors. So they started killing those Christians as well. And so Lebanon turned into just a killing fest. And that's exactly what's going to happen in the UK. Because if you notice, and this is why I think this is true, if you notice, right, that people talk about the Inquisition. The Inquisition was an ethnic cleansing which was created by 12 generations of Islamic rule over Spain. So that is what is going to happen. Islam, 99% will take over Western Europe, and there'll be the civil war. The Muslims will win because the fake left will side with them, and they are ideologically driven when everyone else is not. So just coming back to what I was saying, just quickly, why do you think, and maybe you have a better explanation, but why do you think that all these terrorist attacks are only causing about 10% of people in Australia and maybe, 30% of people in the US to side with Trump? Why is it only 30%? And look how many terrorist attacks have happened. Yeah. So the question was, why do you think, after all these attacks that have been happening for the last 10 to 20 years, that only a minority of Western civilization is siding with what we call the radical right? Marine Le Pen got slaughtered in the elections. Toby Robertson gets completely put down and abused, and his following is very strong, but it's only a minority. Today, the only way to save civilization today is to do what Israel did. which is come in, steal everyone's land, and massacre everybody and get them out, right? So, and people say what Israel did was a bad thing. Yes, sorry. With Israel, that's exactly right. It was not that simple. But people want to simplify it, and they blame Israel. And that's exactly my point. You're right. That my point is that it's not that simple. And if you look at it in larger context, it was a retaliation. So Zionists shouldn't have been there in the first place, but the Jews wanted a homeland. Liberalism is hated by Islam. Exactly. What I want everyone to hear what Liran said. What Liran just wrote was absolutely 100% spot on, right? The Jews, and I've said this before, I've said this in another scope, most Jews did not support Zionism, but because they were getting slaughtered by the Arabs and by the Germans, then they had nowhere to go, so they sided with the Zionists and said, well, at least we've got something, because life under the enemy is better than life under the right, we hope. Correct, and that is exactly, that mind that you have is exactly the mindset that I have and witnessed in Lebanon and in Iran. What happens is that you hate the right so much that you think it will be better under them, but you're the first ones that will be murdered because you're leftist. So you're homosexual, as far as Islam is concerned, you're homosexual, even if you're not actually gay, right? You're homosexual, you're disgusting, you wear shorts, you're artist, you have long hair, you don't groom yourself properly, you don't wash yourself, you eat pork, or you're a vegan, so you're a fag. So you have fake leftists, who a lot of whom are actually not bad people, but they have so much resentment from the way that they were treated. And I can promise you, that person who wrote that thing about the white people, nobody that you know was treated worse than me, right? Growing up with Australians, right? And I don't have that viewpoint that you have. Liberalism likes Islam because they both hate Western civilization. That is correct. They have a common hatred for Western civilization. Now, the hatred, be careful. The hatred that fake leftists have is in part justified. The conclusion is not justified. So they are mistreated. Yes. Is it because of the patriarchy? In part, yes. In part, no. Is it because of capitalism? In part, yes. In part, no. Let's say Tommy Robinson, right now, today, is elected Prime Minister of the UK. Pretend that he's elected today. Right now, today, which is never going to happen. Let's assume he is, right? Work with me on this. If he's elected today, and he implements what he wants, which is a ban on all Muslims coming in, we get rid of all Muslims who are not, who don't hold citizenship, and who express values that are antithetical to Western civilization. And we shut down almost all of the mosques because they all preach radical stuff according to him. And I'm not defending or supporting him. I'm saying imagine if he's elected today and puts all of that in, right? What do you think's going to happen? How many white English people are going to rise up in violence against his policies? 1%, 10%, 0%, 50%? If Tommy Robinson was elected today, there would be a civil war. Exactly 50%. And if it's 50%, that means that you would lose 50% at least, exactly. That means that already the numbers are against you, which means that Tommy Robinson is not going to be elected today. So if the chance that there's going to be a civil war by him being elected today was basically going to happen and that you're probably going to lose, what do you think the chance of civil war is in the future after another 10 years of terrorist attacks when someone like Tommy Robinson actually does get elected? If that is true, right, what are you going to do about it right now? Why do they hate the West? Look up Jordan Peterson's argument on postmodernism, and that will explain to you why they hate the West. It comes from resentment. It comes from the resentment of being mistreated. Now, I was heavily mistreated by people who looked very much like you guys. Are the demographics really that extreme? I don't know. No one knows, right? It's not even real Marxism, because ironically, a lot of Marxist doctrines were enshrined within what Trump was preaching. Right? This is one of the ironies. This is why real conservatives hated Trump, because Trump actually was a partial Marxist, and Marx predicted the rise of the worker, which is exactly what happened in the US. It's almost nihilism. Yeah. So what you guys need today, the only way that the West will survive in its current form, is that someone today rises up, and the civil war begins now. Now, I'm not advising that, right? And I'm not advising that. I'm not here to say yes, it's going to happen, or yes, it's not, or I want it. No, my country's already gone, right? So I know I'm already living in a post-apocalyptic world, right? I go back to Lebanon, and every mass on Sunday, people go to church protected by machine guns, right? The president is a Christian by law, and every day he tries to get murdered because people hate the fact that Lebanon is still legally a Christian country, right? A Christian majority. The only way the West survives is a return to Catholic monarchy and the Catholic state. This is true. This is true. But the problem with that is that I wouldn't want that. And most people wouldn't want that either. That is the problem. So as far as I'm concerned, I feel like I'm talking to you from the future, because I see my country that people now think is, where are you from? I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed to say that my ancestry is from Lebanon, right? And so I don't say it. I say I'm Maronite, or, we're from around the world now. We don't have a country, right? That's true. This is true. You're right. Maybe technology, once we integrate with it, there's a country called Neuralink, there's a company called Neuralink, which I think, what's that guy? Elon Musk is involved in, and they're looking at integrating the brain with computers. That's true. They're not, it's not that they don't believe in logic, they're against logic. So they believe in logic, but they are against it. In fact, I believe Jacques Derrida entitled the West as a fallow logo-centric system. Believe there is no one truth or relative. But that's ironic, because if you believe that itself is a truth that they're espousing. What country are you from? I am now living in exile in Australia, just like when the Jews were taken over by the Babylonians and the Persians and everyone else. They lived in exile for centuries until they were able to reclaim their country. So we Maronites live in exile in the West. 17 million of us all live in the West because our country of Lebanon was hijacked and taken over by the fake left in combination with the Muslim radicals. And so we are now living in a post-apocalyptic world, and I've come back to the present, to you guys, to let you know that that's where you're going. Sorry, we need a bigger platform. I'm giving a speech on the 15th of July, a public speech. So you can either come to it or I'll broadcast it live on Periscope. Would you rather fight a great white on land or a kangaroo in the water? The white on land, because then I could run away.